So, Richard, pilots love watching fighter airplanes with Thunderbirds. You were Thunderbird lead.
Yeah.
And you had the opportunity, I guess, to maybe visit with some of your comrades who have had that position in the past. What was that like going back?
Yeah, it was fantastic. Last weekend, the current commander leader called now think about this, he called all former commander leaders in to look over his operation and watch a couple air shows and give him feedback.
Oh boy.
I mean, the most pressure-packed shows you fly are in front of the alumni because they know what they're looking at.
Right.
And this guy calls us all in and asks for that feedback. It was remarkable.
Yeah.
And we had such a good weekend together, and
Right.
the team is in such good shape right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. That's great to hear. So, but what's it like when you get the call and they say, we've seen your application and we want you to come fly for us, or how's that work?
Yeah, it's just a fantastic call, especially, if it's something that I grew up watching the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels, and those are some of my earliest memories of aviation. And the application process is really long. At the time, I almost didn't even throw in an application because I just didn't think I would qualify at that level.
Right.
But I finally did, and then you go through you go visit with the team. You go through an interview process. The reality is, there's a bunch of people that are qualified enough to hold and fly the position. In the commander position, they're looking for leadership qualities and the ability to command the squadron. But then, can you just get along with people on the road for 275 days flying the same profile, every day? That's a big part of it. So you go visit with them, and then you do interviews all the way up to the 4-star level.
Wow.
And in my case, they pranked me a little bit when they made the announcement. My boss, who's a great guy, Bean Freeney, he called me in, and I was the operations officer his operations officer at the time. And he called me into his office, and when I walked in there was the wing commander, 1-star, and an 06 ops group commander, and Bean Freeney. And Bean starts and he says, we're just gonna have to make a change we're gonna need a new operations officer, which was my spot. And I'm thinking, they're gonna fire me? I mean, I'm thinking through all the stuff that I've done wrong. As pilots, you always have these little secrets that you have, that you think nobody knows about. And I'm thinking, they're going to fire me? And then the wing commander comes forward and says, we need a new operations officer because you're going to be Thunderbird 1.
Oh, wow.
And that was just a fantastic day.
Yeah.
Fantastic day.
Yeah. So when you got the call about coming to the Thunderbirds, who'd you call?
Yeah, so after that session, after I kind of got through the shock of, I'm not fired, and I'm gonna go run the Thunderbirds. It was that call happened at Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City, Florida, which is my hometown and where I grew up.
Right.
And one of my first memories is on that very ramp, being on my dad's shoulders watching the Thunderbirds fly back in the day. Yeah. So I kind of detoured back and stood up on this perch and overlooked the flight line, and it was just such an incredible time and an incredible moment. And so I walked back and called my dad first, and it was just a real special time for us both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. He must have been super proud.
Yeah, I suspect so. But yeah, it's a good time. Fantastic day.
Yeah. What's it like flying for them for the first time and being observed at that level?
Yeah, it was pretty intense. For the tryout portion, I was an F-15 guy. I'd never flown the F-16 before, and for the tryout portion, I think they narrowed down to maybe 5 or 6 of us, and they brought us to Nellis for the flyout, for the tryouts. And I was a little nervous about that, because I hadn't flown the F-16 before, and they put you in the back seat. And the guy who I flew with said, "Don't worry about it. 10 or 15 minutes, you'll get this side stick stuff. It'll come naturally." And he was right. We took off. He gave me the airplane. I'd sort of wobbled around for a little bit, and then you go, it's basically just flying. And anybody who's flown a Cirrus or transitioned to anything with a side stick,
right,
kind of realizes, it's really not that big a deal. It's really not. You've probably done that.
Yeah, and everybody's intimidated by it, and 5 minutes later, by the time you take off, it's like completely natural.
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, back in some form or fashion, whether it's this way or that way, and the trees get smaller,
Yeah.
And so that came, pretty easily. And then they just really what they're looking for is how comfortable are you? You know, your airmanship sort of flying around with people hanging on your wing. And that was the biggest thing I thought when I took over. I really thought the sobering part of that was there's 5 guys that are going to be hanging off my wing within, you know, pretty close range, and they never look forward. They're entirely focused on you. It's such a tremendous element of trust, and I thought I'll never violate that trust. And I set some priorities through my time as a leadership there. I would first and foremost always have flying airspeed and a clear flight path, and that would keep the formation safe. Then I would work on being predictable, and then smooth, and then precise. Now you have to get to that precision part or you have no business being with the Thunderbirds. But there were times, and I learned this the hard way, where I would put that precision part, like working on the timing and the deconfliction, so hard that I would lose some of the smoothness. And in that, I realized I was putting the precision in front of the predictability and smoothness, and you can't do that. And that's probably a pretty good rule of thumb for anybody that's leading formation is flying airspeed, a clear flight path, be predictable. Your wingmen want you to be predictable, then be smooth, then worry about precision.
In other words, fly the airplane.
Yeah.
You must have had some great stories. How long were you with the Thunderbirds?
It's 2 years. That's typical for both the Blues and the Thunderbirds. They run 2-year tours, and there's a good reason for that. Is it's human nature that once you're exposed to an element of risk over and over again for a long period, you begin to be a little bit calloused about it. I can remember watching. We had a lead solo pilot who was just one of the best pilots I've ever flown with. He went on to be a general officer in the Air Force, just a phenomenal pilot and a phenomenal officer. But I remember watching his tape one time, and he's a lead solo, so he's inverted. He's about 150 feet or so doing 500 knots. And as you know, when you go inverted, your controls are reversed. So if you want to push away from the ground, you push the stick forward. He's inverted at 500 knots, and he's fiddling with something on the top of his canopy.
Oh my gosh.
And I stopped it and called him in and said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Well, there's a bug on the top of my canopy. It's kind of annoying me." And you know, it's that kind of stuff is why they limit it to 2 years. And it's pretty demanding. You're on the road, 250 days a year, and that's enough. And you know, you're a combat pilot, so the Air Force wants you back in the gray world.
Of course. So what's it like managing those personalities and I mean that's they're pilots and then fighter pilots and then Thunderbird pilots. I mean, it's a lot of testosterone and a lot of guys out there with strong opinions.
It was, and I think I think I grew into that. Initially it is something that you work into. You've got people who are very talented. And here's the interesting thing about the lead position, whether you're the Blues or the Thunderbirds. You've never done anything like that before. You're 18 years in your career or so. You've got a lot of experience. You've maybe even been to combat, which I had over in Iraq. But then you come back and you've never led high speed, low altitude, close formation aerobatics. And so you step in on day one and your wingmen, you rely on them a lot. And so there's a balance between them teaching you and you saying, yeah, but we're not going to do it that way anymore. I see this, I have concerns about this, and we're going to make this adjustment. And that's a real dynamic that each team has to work every year.
So you grew up in an aviation family, have had a bunch of airplanes over the years, numerous airplanes. Any of that translate back to your general aviation flying? And how do you come at your general aviation flying, do you think, differently as a result of your experience in the Air Force?
Yeah, from GA flying, what I think is sometimes people will come out of the military or the airlines and they'll see the safety record and all the procedures and the operations, and they'll want to replicate in that GA because they'll want the same safety level. Of course, that would be a big problem for us because as much as I loved my military flying in the airlines, they do a pretty good job of eliminating just about any fun that's left in aviation because they make it so procedural. And my observation of coming into GA is that in many cases it takes a lot more airmanship to fly GA because as a GA pilot, you're the chief of maintenance, you're the chief of operations, you're the chief flight instructor, you're the chief finance. You know, you make all those judgments on whether or not your airplane's safe to fly, whether or not you're ready to fly, whether or not the conditions are okay.
Yep.
All of that is proceduralized in the military and the airlines to a great extent, not completely, but to a great extent. And so the airmanship involved in flying GA is important. And I also think GA airplanes, especially like, as you know, Dave's trying to help me learn to fly this 180.
Yeah.
And that 180 is a handful.
Yeah.
And that is as challenging an airplane as I can remember flying. And certainly in the landing phase. There's some comical relief there in some of my attempts to land that thing.
Yeah, and you got a seaplane rating recently too.
Yeah, seaplane rating, and as you know, you've got all these ratings. There's so much fun things to do in general aviation.
Right.
That's part of the whole fun of the thing.
Yeah. So tell me about the seaplane flying. Any experiences there that stand out for you?
Yeah, I think Dave and I were up, and he was checking me out in seaplane flying. We were in Mark Baker's Super Cub on floats. We were up in Minnesota. Do we want to keep going? Keep going. We're up in Minnesota, and it was just beautiful countryside. We're in the Super Cub at 500 feet. I think I was climbing up to like 2,000 feet, and Dave says, "Why are you going that high?" There's no reason to go that high in a Super Cub on floats. Yeah. So we're dropping down, and Dave says, "Hey, let's go land in that lake over there." And I'm like, "We can just pick out a lake and land anywhere? Is this a great concept or what?" And just the whole freedom of that is fantastic.
Yeah, I had the same observation down in Florida, Central Florida. There's lakes everywhere, and they're like almost all of them are open for landings. And you just take off on one lake, hop over the trees, land on the next one, hop over the trees, land on the next one.
Yeah. And
it's just amazing. You have that much freedom out there.
Yeah.
And, with the seaplane, you're always looking for a place to land, right? So that's the excuse for flying low. I mean, I've flown with Mark Baker in seaplanes as well. And, you get up to 800 feet, and he's like, "Man, I'm getting a nosebleed. What's this all about?"
Yeah, he did the same thing. I flew with Mark, and I think, the same kind of thing. He's like, "Why are you going this high?"
So it is quite a different experience.
Yeah, just a ton of fun.
Yeah, so your family's had a Navy on for a long time, too, and recently parted ways with that. What was that like?
Yeah, that was a hard decision that was over a year in the making, really, quite honestly. We'd had that Navy on for almost 40 years.
Wow.
I learned to fly in it before I went and flew in the Air Force, and it really helped me out a lot, because if you take a look at a T-37 and a Navy on, they are remarkably similar in terms of their physical characteristics, the wingspan, and importantly, the height above the ground.
Right.
So I had a lot of time in that Navy on, which I didn't fess up to when I went in the Air Force. I got some really good advice. A good friend of ours, Tony Russell, said, "Hey, there's no need to tell the Air Force about all this experience you have. Just let them think you're some kind of wonderkind or something." So that was really good advice. So I went in, and the very first time I flew a T-37, I flew it out to Dogfish or Doghead, I forget the name of the field out there from Enid, Oklahoma, and just landed it first time, no problem. And they were a little bit surprised by that, but I had a pretty savvy instructor that said, you've got a lot more experience than you fessed up to. So I was outed after the first sortie, but yeah. So, and my brother really got a bunch of his ratings in that. I gave my son his high performance checkout rating in it. I gave our daughter her hood time in the Navy on. My parents, it was really their vehicle for, social engagement. They landed that airplane in all 48 lower states.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
Through the years.
Good for them.
Yeah, and so, but Dad was getting a little bit older, and the plane was at that point where it needed somebody who was going to invest in it long term. That's the plane they wanted. My brother had bought a beautiful UPF-7 Waco that had been restored ground up. I was really interested in backcountry flying, so it was time to turn the page. The aircraft had provided so much lift to our aviation family. It was at the point where not so much anymore. It was time to look somewhere else. So we sold it. We sold it to a great family, very close to my dad, and they keep in touch with him. So that's all good. So it all turned out well. But it was an emotional decision when the airplane taxied away. I wasn't able to be there. I think there were some weather issues or something. But people took some pictures of my parents and the ramp, and it wasn't just my parents. There was a lot of people that were there on the airport that knew that airplane that were shedding a few tears there. So that was really a hard time for us. But in the end, it was the right thing for us to do.
Amazing how airplanes can become a part of our lives, and such an emotional attachment that we have for them.
Yeah, for sure.
It's almost like a family pet.
Yeah.
Or a kid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It really is.